You're 23 years old, sitting on the edge of a twin bed in a shared apartment, holding two $20 bills that just arrived as a birthday gift from your grandmother, and you're doing something you've never consciously done before with money. You're not deciding what to buy with it. You're deciding whether to buy anything with it at all. This shouldn't feel like a big moment. It's $40. And yet you sit there longer than the decision seems to warrant, turning over a question that, until this exact evening, has never actually occurred to you as a question worth asking. What if the money isn't for spending right now? What if it's for something later, something you can't fully picture yet, something that only exists if this exact $40, and the next one, and the one after that, get treated differently than every dollar before them has been treated? You put it in a drawer instead of your wallet. Nothing about your actual financial situation changes that night. You're still broke, still splitting rent 4 ways, still eating the same 7 meals in rotation you've eaten for years. But something changes anyway, quietly, in a place no bank statement could ever measure, and it takes you years to understand that this exact evening, on the edge of a twin bed, holding $40 you didn't spend, was the actual beginning of everything that came after it, long before there was any real money to speak of at all. Every level of wealth changes the way you think. Almost nobody tells you that the very first change, the one that makes every subsequent one possible, has nothing to do with how much money you have and everything to do with the exact moment you first treat a dollar as a decision instead of a reflex. This is the part almost nobody explains accurately, because most of the content about wealthy thinking assumes you need money first in order to start thinking differently about it. The truth runs backward from that assumption entirely. The thinking has to change first, at whatever income you're currently living on, or the money, if it ever arrives at all, simply passes through the exact same untouched wiring it always has. Shift 1, from reflex to decision. Where it actually starts. That night with the $40 is the whole shift in miniature, and understanding it properly matters more than any of the shifts that come after it, because none of the others are possible without this one happening first. Before this shift, every dollar that arrives gets spent according to the same automatic logic. Need something. Dollar arrives, dollar leaves. No meaningful gap between the two events for a decision to actually occur inside. You've lived this way for years without ever noticing it as a pattern, the way you don't notice your own breathing until someone asks you to pay attention to it. The $40 from your grandmother becomes the first time you consciously insert a gap into that automatic sequence, a pause where a decision gets to happen instead of a reflex. You start doing this deliberately after that night, not with every dollar, not perfectly, but often enough that it becomes a real, trackable habit within a year, pausing, before most non-trivial purchases, to ask a version of the same question you asked yourself on the twin bed. The habit doesn't make you rich. You're still, a year later, living on roughly the same income, in roughly the same apartment. But you've started accumulating something that has nothing to do with dollars, a track record of decisions instead of reflexes. And that track record, more than any specific dollar amount, turns out to be the actual foundation everything else gets built on top of. The first shift isn't about having money to manage. It's about discovering that a gap can exist at all between a dollar arriving and a dollar leaving, and once you know that gap exists, you can never fully unknow it again, regardless of how much or how little money is actually passing through it. Shift 2, from immediate to compounding. The discovery that time is a resource. This shift arrives a few years later, once you've got a small but real amount actually saved, sitting in an account for the first time in your life, and it announces itself the day you finally sit down and calculate, seriously, what that modest amount could become in 20 years if you simply left it alone and kept adding to it. The math surprises you more than it probably should, given how simple it actually is, a modest monthly contribution, compounded over decades, arriving at a number large enough that you have to run the calculation twice to believe it. What changes here isn't your bank account, which hasn't grown by a single dollar from doing this math. What changes is your relationship to time itself, a specific, new understanding that time isn't just something you're passing through, it's an actual resource, one that works quietly in your favor the earlier you start feeding it, and works quietly against you every year you delay. You start making small decisions differently after this shift. Not dramatically, but noticeably, choosing the account with the better long-term structure over the one with the flashier short-term feature, understanding, for the first time, that a decision's real cost or benefit often lives 20 years downstream of the moment you actually make it, invisible in the present tense entirely. The second shift teaches you that time is a resource you're either investing or spending in every financial decision you make, whether you notice it or not, and once you can see that dimension clearly, you start evaluating decisions on a timeline most people around you have never once learned to look at. Shift 3. From ownership as status to ownership as leverage. This one arrives later, once you've got some actual assets to think about, and it shows up first as a genuine confusion you have to work through rather than an instant realization, triggered by a coworker's new car, financed heavily, that briefly makes your own older, paid-off vehicle feel embarrassing by comparison. You sit with that feeling for a few days, genuinely uncomfortable, before you do the actual math on what the coworker's new car costs him monthly versus what your paid-off car costs you, and the exercise reframes something you'd never consciously examined before. You'd been unconsciously measuring ownership as a status signal, the newer, nicer version automatically read as the better financial decision, when the actual math frequently runs in the opposite direction entirely. Owning something outright, especially something that doesn't generate income, isn't inherently smart just because it feels more adult than renting or waiting. And taking on debt isn't inherently reckless just because it feels less secure than paying cash. You start asking a different question after this shift, about every major purchase or financial structure you consider. Does this specific form of ownership give me leverage towards something I actually want, or is it simply the version that looks most like what ownership is supposed to look like? The question reorganizes decisions you've been making on autopilot for years, based entirely on what grown-up ownership was supposed to resemble rather than what actually served your specific goals. The third shift is the moment you stop asking whether owning something makes you look successful and start asking whether it actually makes you more capable of building the specific life you're trying to build. And those two questions, it turns out, have wildly different answers more often than almost anyone expects going in. Shift 4. From reactive risk to calculated risk. This shift arrives with your first real financial setback, a modest investment loss in your early 30s. Small in absolute terms, but large enough to trigger a genuine emotional reaction, the specific kind of full-body regret that makes you want to swear off risk-taking of any kind for the rest of your life. You almost do exactly that for about 6 weeks, moving everything into the most conservative options available, a reaction that feels, in the moment, like wisdom earned through hard experience. What actually shifts your thinking, eventually, is a conversation with an older colleague who's weathered several genuine market downturns over a much longer career, who tells you something that reframes the entire experience. The loss itself wasn't the mistake. The mistake, if there was one, was in how the position was sized relative to your actual financial picture, a completely different lesson then. Risk itself is dangerous, and one that actually points you toward a smarter relationship with risk instead of away from risk entirely. You start thinking about risk differently after this, not as a binary you either accept or avoid, but as a dial you calibrate deliberately, based on actual math about position sizing and time horizon rather than raw emotional reaction to a single bad outcome. This shift, more than almost any other, is the one that separates people who stay financially stuck after a setback from people who use the setback as actual data and keep moving. The fourth shift is the difference between fearing risk and understanding it. And the gap between those two states is almost entirely made up of the specific, unglamorous math most people skip because the emotional reaction to a loss feels more urgent, in the moment, than the analysis that would actually explain what the loss was trying to teach you. Shift 5. From scarcity identity to sufficiency identity. This is the deepest shift, the one that takes the longest to arrive, and it doesn't announce itself with a single event the way the earlier shifts do. It arrives slowly, cumulatively, somewhere in your 40s, and you notice it first not in a financial decision at all, but in a conversation with your own kid, watching her worry, uncharacteristically, over a modest purchase you know, with total certainty, your family can easily absorb. You realize, watching her worry, that some part of your own thinking, even now, even with real financial security behind you, still occasionally defaults to a scarcity identity built decades earlier, in a childhood where every dollar genuinely mattered, an identity that never fully updates itself just because the external circumstances eventually changed. The fifth shift isn't really a single event. It's an ongoing, deliberate practice, catching that old identity mid-thought and consciously replacing it with a sufficiency identity instead, one that asks, "What do I actually want?" rather than, "What can I not afford to risk?" A question you have to keep choosing on purpose for years, before it finally starts arriving on its own. The fifth shift is the one that never fully finishes, because the identity installed by genuine scarcity, if you ever lived through it, doesn't disappear just because the actual math eventually changed underneath it. You just get better, with deliberate practice, at noticing when it's running the show and choosing, consciously, to think differently instead. You're back on the edge of a bed, decades later, a different bed in a different life entirely, holding a different piece of paper, not $40 this time, but a portfolio summary showing a number that would have seemed like fiction to the 23-year-old who sat in almost this exact position, deciding, for the first time, not to spend a birthday gift immediately. You think about that 23-year-old sometimes, genuinely broke, splitting rent 4 ways, eating the same 7 meals in rotation, and you understand now, with real clarity, that he wasn't waiting for money to arrive before he started thinking differently. He was the one who made the thinking change first, on a Tuesday that meant nothing to anyone else in the world, holding an amount of money too small to matter to almost any measure except the one that actually mattered, whether a decision was finally happening where a reflex used to run automatically instead. Every level of wealth changes the way you think, but the changes were never actually caused by the money arriving. They were caused by a specific decision, made first, at whatever income you happen to be living on at the time, and the money, when and if it eventually shows up, is mostly just the evidence of a mind that already learned, years earlier, how to think about it differently before there was anything real to think about at all.